your host, Gary Baumgarten. Well, since September the 11th, 2001, there's been a lot of attention given to terrorism and the threat of terrorism in the United States and abroad. We obviously have a worldwide audience here on Paltalk.com, and so we don't just talk narrowly in a narrowly nationalistic way about this issue. We have been talking about how it affects people all around the world, in Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, and there's been discussion about the success and lack thereof on this, what we call war on terrorism. We have seen some recent successes. We've seen some terrorist attempts or threats thwarted by the various agencies. We just talked about a couple of them right here on News Talk the other day. So one gets the impression that the authorities are trying the best that they can, yet there is a frustration that they may not be successful. And despite their best efforts in what is being called war on terrorism, sometime in the future, perhaps not the too distant future, it is a foregone conclusion that the terrorists will be successful and we will be attacked. And so then we start talking about how to ratchet up this war on terrorism. And we seemingly all are in agreement that terrorism obviously is a bad thing and that we have to defend ourselves against it. And if anything, the criticism about the war on terrorism has pointed toward the fact that it is not stringent enough. It's not effective enough. So that's why when I read this particular report from the Oxford Research Group in the United Kingdom, I said, I got to get the author of the report on News Talk Online on Paltalk.com, because according to Paul Rogers from the Oxford Research Group, a fundamental rethink, to quote the report, is needed on the war on terror. He suggests that the war on terror is actually empowering Al-Qaeda, and that rather than attack Al-Qaeda head-on, the root of its support must be understood and undercut. That's what Paul Rogers has to say about this. So we welcome you, Paul Rogers, to News Talk Online on Paltalk.com. And I am not hearing Paul Rogers, Boaz.
Hello, I can just hear you. Unfortunately, it's a very bad line, but I could just hear you. But sorry, I hope you can hear me clearly.
You are booming in, and I will try to speak up. Usually they tell me to turn it down, Gary. You're a big loudmouth person. I don't know, did you hear my introduction to you? Did I get it right?
Yes, I heard most of the introduction, just a rather bad line. Sorry about that.
Okay, well, we'll deal with it and ask everybody to speak a little bit more loudly than they usually do when they ask questions. So how can it be that our war on terror is actually helping feed Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations? That sounds to me to be a bit of a counterintuitive proposition.
It probably is, but I think what one has to accept is that we are now moving into the 7th year of the war on terror. The operation to terminate the Taliban regime in Afghanistan actually started, about 6 years ago, just last week, and essentially the state of insecurity in Afghanistan is considerable. The Taliban movement has staged a major comeback. The Al-Qaeda movement is well ensconced in western Pakistan and southeast Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda as a worldwide movement is probably more active than it was 5 or 6 years ago. It has more support. And in Iraq, the United States and its coalition partners do remain mired in a very difficult conflict. So if one stands back and takes a detached view, I think one is forced to come to the conclusion that the war on terror, as it enters its 7th year, is not going as remotely as well as was originally expected. And at the very least, I think there needs to be a major rethink. But I would go farther than that. I think the problem is that this entire operation has been treated as something like a war in the conventional sense, which is really very much what the Al-Qaeda movement wanted. The 9/11 atrocities were very much designed almost to bring the United States into their home territory in Afghanistan and indeed more recently in Iraq. And I think what we are arguing in this report is that it was mistaken from the start to conduct the operations against Al-Qaeda in this manner. It is fair to say that the group that has published the report, Oxford Research Group, was saying this at the start, in the opening weeks after 9/11. It was warning against using a very heavy military response. And sadly, in some ways tragically, I think the kind of analysis it was doing then, which was very much a minority view, now makes rather more sense than many people would have expected.
Okay, Gary.
Hello?
No. Please stand by. No sound, Gary.
Hello, can you hear me?
That's odd. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you very well now, yes.
Oh, okay, great. I was suggesting that on September the 11th, 2001, we all saw what occurred, and I wanted my president to go out. I didn't want him to go necessarily into Iraq and do what he's doing there, but I wanted him to go out and grab the guy responsible, who I think we all would agree is Osama bin Laden,
Yeah.
wring his neck and, you know, drag him along Broadway and let him walk free down the streets of New York City. I think that would be a splendid thing to do to Osama bin Laden. What's wrong with that kind of a reaction to what occurred on September 11th and what happened in your country on 7/7?
Well, the problem is that that reaction, immediately moving to terminate the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, was exactly what the Al-Qaeda planners wanted. That was the intent, the large-scale intention of the 9/11 atrocities. What you have to remember from their perspective, their predecessors, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s, had, from their perspective, defeated one of the world's superpowers, the Soviet Union. And from their perspective, I'm not talking in any way how we see it, from their perspective, the United States was, as they call it, the far enemy. And what they were anticipating was that the U.S. would come in with very considerable force to do precisely that, to use very strong military force to detain or kill Osama bin Laden, Mullah Omar, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and the rest. So in other words, from our perspective, from an American perspective, it seemed the only thing to do. But the problem is, from their perspective, they actually wanted you to do that. It's very difficult, I think, to get to grips with this. But what one has to appreciate is we are now, over 6 years later, bin Laden is still free, Zawahiri is still free, Mullah Omar is still free. And this, I think, is where we've at least got to rethink what we were about that first time and see whether, firstly, there could have been another way to do it, secondly, whether we should change what we're doing now.
My guest is Paul Rogers. He's the author of the Oxford Research Group think tank report about the war on terrorism, in which they are arguing, and it's very provocative and it's stimulating conversations such as the one we're having right here, which I believe is a good thing, that the way the United States and its allies responded to the 9/11 attacks specifically, and the other attacks around the world in general, actually playing into the hands of Al-Qaeda. So, Paul Rogers, what would you suggest that those who are charged with protecting their homelands do as a way of protecting their citizens from the threat of terrorism?
Well, the first thing they do not do is do what the enemies want them to do. That's the first thing, and that is absolutely fundamental. If you're facing a threat from a group such as Al-Qaeda, what you absolutely have to do is to